Om Namo Bhagavate Shri Ekam Aksharam Rudinirantaram Bhasate Swayam Likyate Tatham Hridaya Kuhara Madhye Kevalam Brahmanatram Yadam Isa Atmarupe Hridivisha Manasam Swam Chinvata Jata Pavanachanamaro Atmanishto Deham Jada Aham Uddanatasya Sketu Naham Tattadha Tisamai Siddha Masadha Om Bhata Radhi Drishta Nalishta So Pitaya Aruna Shivaha Vibha Swami So Pitaya Aruna Shivaha Vibha Swami Ramana. We have been meditating on the verses of Vivekachoodamani. The original is by Adi Shankara, and we are relying on the translation in Tamil of Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi. We have come to the point where the Acharya is looking at how the Vijnanamaya Kosha is also a bondage for the Jiva. So we are roughly looking at least in one version of the work, from verses 186 to 211 of the original, and the verses are covered by Bhagavan in prose form. We go into this content. I have posted the content in Bhagavan's prose work in our group. You can go through that. So our emphasis will be to try and get some practical inputs from these verses to our sadhana. the verses start like this, that the intellect with the 5 Jnanendriyas is the Vijnanamaya sheath. And this is also a bondage for the Jiva, just like the Manomaya Kosha, which we had discussed in the last satsang. And from here on, the Vijnanamaya Kosha is delineated for us, and one can pay attention to get the understanding as to what the Advaita Vedanta treats as the intellectual sheath. So from here on, that description runs for some verses. The intellectual sheath itself is a modification of the unmanifest, beginningless self, which has taken the form of the ahankara, the ego, and conducts all the activities through the reflected light of consciousness. So the light with which the intellectual sheath functions is not Swayam Prakasha. It is a reflected light, it is a borrowed light. That is why Bhagavan would say in Ulladu Narpadu, Madikuli Thandu, Madikul Polirum, Madinai Ulle Madaki, Padil Paditidal Padiyai Madiyal Maditidal Lingan. That the Supreme Being is the light of lights shining within the mind, within the buddhi, within the intellect, giving light to that intellect. And can the intellect ever measure that light of lights is the import of Bhagavan's verse. We come to the Vijnanamaya Kosha description. The interesting part in Acharya's work is that the ego is considered as one of the modifications of the Vijnanamaya Kosha. We should understand that in Bhagavan's teachings, Ahandai undayin anaitum undam. Ahandai indrel indranaitum. So, whatever is the area of bondage arises on the rising of the ego in Bhagavan's teachings. Here, the approach of Advaita Vedanta is that the ego is a modification present in the Vijnanamaya Kosha. And in the talks, you will find Bhagavan taking this position to explain the Advaita Vedanta of Acharya to the questioners appropriately. Let us go in and see as to how this Vijnanamaya Kosha carries the ego. That ego regards the body and the senses as I, and the senses and body is mode of life, duties, actions, and quality. It calls as mind. So the primary source of bondage, the actual manifestation of bondage in this world, arises from the Vijnanamaya Kosha or the ego, the Vijnanamaya Kosha rising and identifying with the body and the senses as I, and whatever is the duties, whatever are the mode of life, the actions and the qualities of these two, of the body and the senses, it calls as mind. And we can recall that across the religions, this is said to be the root of bondage, that the non and the I and mind, and the crossing over or the dropping or cutting asunder of this I and mind is said to be liberation in across the religious belief systems. So it is in the Vijnanamaya Kosha that this I and mind rises. What does the ego do? It classifies through its discrimination actions as good and evil, and according to the good and evil acts that it does, based on the previous vasanas, the previous tendencies, it attains to greater or lesser lokas. We say that he has gone to Swarga, he has gone to the Devaloka, or he has gone to some other lower domain to experience the negative actions that it has done. But the key point the Acharya makes is, after roaming around in these domains where it has to undergo the experiences or the results of its actions, it finds or gets enticed into a appropriate womb and appears back in this domain of the earth or the bhumi or the prakriti and starts doing its sadhana again. The sadhana that involves all these things, that the Vijnanamaya Kosha, where the Supreme Self is said to identify with the ego, and that ego identifies with the body and senses as I, and it carries the mind along with it wherever it goes. Then comes that the Jagrat, Swapna, Sushupti avasthas are also experienced by the ego. So when the ego is crossed, or when the delusion of the ego is dropped, as we are going to see in the later part of this segment, what all will be crossed? The I and mind in the earlier segment, which was mentioned, will be crossed, as well as the states in which the Jiva finds itself. The Jagrat, Swapna, Sushupti also will be crossed. So one has to keep in mind that both these which are mentioned, that is the chronological time in which one plays one's roles, as well as the mental time modes of Jagrat, Swapna, Sushupti, the avasthas in which the Jiva finds itself trapped, both will be cut asunder, as will be revealed to us in the crossing of the delusion verses that will come towards the end of this segment. Now, within this sheath, within this Vijnanamaya Kosha, we find the Supreme Being, we find the Supreme Self, which is shining, self-effulgent, which is homogeneous, which is the truth, which is all-pervasive, which is complete, which is immutable, and it is the Supreme Lord. We have to understand that when it says that the Supreme Self is found within the Vijnanamaya Kosha, it is also found within the Annamaya, Pranamaya, Manomaya, and Vijnanamaya Koshas is what we have to understand. Usually, when something is within another, we will think that what is within is inferior, or what is within is contained within the cover. But here, in the koshas, what happens is the perspective is from the gross body. The gross body is actually a pot-like thing, inside which these subtle koshas are there. That is Pranamaya Kosha, Manomaya Kosha, Vijnanamaya Kosha. And what is within is far more vaster than the grosser ones. That is, the Pranamaya Kosha is supposed to be of much greater dimension than the Annamaya. Manomaya is of much greater dimension than the Pranamaya. Vijnanamaya is much more greater dimension than the Manomaya. And Anandamaya is much greater in dimension than the other four koshas that it permeates. And of course, you will find that the unmanifest self, the beginningless self which is within, is obviously greater than any of these koshas. So we should understand this difference, as we found earlier in discussing Carl Sagan, that when he discusses the dimensions, we should recall that whenever a higher dimension being talks to a lesser dimension being, that is, let us say, a three-dimensional being talks to a two-dimensional being, then that voice of the three-dimensional being appears from within the two-dimensional being. It is very simple, isn't it? That when I am trapped in three dimension, everything outside of me is only three dimension. So when a higher dimension being is in communion or communication with me, I have to experience that within me. That is why many of us will find when the Guru appears in our dreams or God appears in our dreams, that experience remains with us for lifelong sadhana, or at least for a long period of time till that experience has completed its purpose. So keep this in mind, that though the Supreme Self is within, It is not contained. It is because of its subtlety, it is experienced within, but in its actuality, it transcends all the other dimensions. So within the sheath of knowledge, just as within the other sheaths, you will find the Supreme Self, which is self-effulgent. Then why does it not know itself? Because this Vijnanamaya Kosha is the closest to the self and it is the subtlest. The identification of the self with the Vijnanamaya Kosha and the ego is said to be the fastest, is said to be the quickest. Identification means being one with that it is not even attachment. When I have an object like that and I say that cupboard is mine, that is attachment. Whereas this identification is even more stronger form of attachment, because I have literally, naturally become one with that. For instance, Bhagavan says that, do we keep saying, I am a human being, I am a human being? No. The moment we get up, the identification with the body and the identification with humanity is automatic. And we don't need to reiterate that throughout the day. In fact, what has to be done is to demystify, is to dehypnotize ourselves from that identity, which is tying us down. But let's come to the Vijnanamaya Kosha. The self assumes the limitations through the false superimposition of the intellect on it in this sheath, because the intellect is closest to the self, and in fact, it is the closest of the adjuncts. Now, to get a glimpse of the speed with which it comes and gets attacked, we can go to the quantum physics area, where the smallest of the particles, which is called as having Planck length, the smallest particle having the Planck length, the time taken for light to traverse within the Planck length unit is 1 second you take, and in that 1 second you will have to divide it into 10 power 33 or 35 parts. And that one part, that is 10 followed by 35 zeros, that many parts you have to make that 1 second. And that one unit is the time taken for light to traverse within the Planck length particle. So we can take that the Vijnanamaya Kosha attachment identification is something as quick as that. And to free ourselves of that, one has to learn this art of observing and letting go of thought. That thought which is so quickly identified with the other thought, one has to learn the art of letting it go. Then one realizes, as we traverse this journey along with Bhagavan's Ulladana, we realize what all kinds of thoughts and what all the thoughts with what kind of breadth and width that Bhagavan helps us traverse, we will be able to understand. But it is sufficient to know that this attachment to the ego is the quickest, and it's almost instantaneous that the Vijnanamaya Kosha is attached, and the Vijnanamaya Kosha, as we said, doesn't remain just as a Vijnanamaya Kosha. It identifies with the body and senses as I, and immediately embraces all the duties, actions, and qualities as mine. As a result, one is deluded into thinking that one is this sheep. Who is the Acharya referring to here? He is referring to us as the self. And that we have forgotten our original nature as the self. And we have very quickly given in to this delusion of identifying with the ego, which is part and parcel of the Vijnanamaya sheath. He gives us two examples. And the two examples are quite interesting and like illuminating in nature. He says that how we are attached is how a pot may consider itself to be separate from the clay because it has come into a different shape and it has taken on the heat and other things and firmly formed a new shape so that it feels it is different from the clay from which it has come. Similarly, the self feels different from itself. Though the source is itself, the ego feels different from the source, just like the clay pot may feel different from the clay. Whereas actually, how the relationship is, the Acharya gives us, it is like the fire in the fireball. Like you should go to this glass blowing company or those companies where scraps are melted. If you go to that furnace and see, then literally the fire is glowing around the shape of that object. That the fire, though it is lighting up the shape of the object, which may be an iron ball or it may be the glass, but it is not constrained by the shape of the glass. So he says that the Atmaswarupa is actually beyond the limitations, like the fire in the fireball. But unfortunately, by identifying with the gross, it feels that it has become the clay pot. There is no becoming in the fire. The fire remains as the fire. That shape of the inner glow is only the shape of the body that is there. Whereas here in clay pot, there seems to have been a becoming. Therefore, the identity is very strong. And the Acharya uses both these examples to make us clear that we should move from gross to subtle to causal to the self. That is the journey we have to make. Now, at this point, the Guru stops explaining, and the Sishya, the disciple, asks an important question in Advaita Vedanta. In Advaita Vedanta, this delusion or Maya is beginningless, anadi. It is anirvachaniya and also it is anadi. Now, the ego, therefore, is anadi in the Vijnanamaya Kosha. Therefore, the disciple asks the Guru, if it is anadi, then it should be also ananta. That is, there should not be any end also. In that case, my bondage becomes continuous and eternal. And if there is no liberation from bondage, what is the point of us going through all these sadhanas is the question. The question reframed again is that how the bondage has been mentioned, that without beginning, the self, the unmanifest self, has identified with the Vijnanamaya Kosha as the ego, and that ego forming has no beginning, that the ego will never be able to know how it came into existence, is the anadi nature. Now, if that is anadi, if something doesn't have a beginning, then to my mind, the disciple says, it doesn't have an end also. Therefore, the bondage becomes firm and eternal. What is the way out of it? Here, the Guru says, good question. Whenever I ask something to Venkateshji, for which he wants some time to answer, or he will immediately say, good question. That means just some gathering of the mind he will do and then answer. Here, it is not like that. The Acharya is really commending the disciple for asking the way out of this Maya. And he goes ahead and says, pay attention. Listen to my explanation with keen mind, with sharp mind, with full focus. And he says that, of course, the structure of the ego or Maya is anadi, is without beginning, but it is an illusion. And the moment, with clear reason, you are able to see that it is an illusion, it comes to an end. It has an ending. The Maya has an ending, and with its ending, we come to the self-luminous self, says the Acharya. That in the traditional Advaita Vedanta, the ignorance or the ego is beginningless, but it can be ended once the illusion is seen. And the Acharya gives an example also there. It is like that serpent in the rope. I used to drive the motorbike during the dusky times in the evenings, when we come in the roads, what will happen? Sometimes a newly tarred road, some plastic bag would have got stuck in the tar and it will be fluttering. And when we drive the bike, it will appear as though some small animal is crossing. So there will be a quick braking and a raising of emotion as to whether we have hit something. Then as we come close, the headlight falling on that plastic, we will realize it's only a plastic bag which has got stuck in the tar. And the illusory nature of the seeing and the illusory image constructed on that going, immediately there is a feeling of freedom. Oh, I got unnecessarily worried. The fear of Dvitiyam goes once the Advitiya Bhavana of Advitiya Sadvastu is realized. So, since it's an illusion, since it is not that the mud pot has really become a mud pot away from the clay, it is only a fire within which the ball, the iron ball or the world is contained, and this fire itself being an illusion, seeing that it is illusory, that there is no fire apart from you, apart from the self. It is in fact a self-luminous glow which you have to experience by itself. It is not an objective light like the fire in a ball. When you realize that, the illusion comes to an end. And there the liberation is. The master replies, this is a good question, my learned disciple. Now listen with one-pointed attention. Whatever has been conjured up by delusion must be examined in the light of reason. Things appear real as long as delusion lasts and perish as unreal and non-existent as soon as the delusion passes. Like the illusion of a serpent seen in a piece of rope appearing real as soon as the illusion lasts. Now it is as simple as that what worries you were taking to be so real, that is because of the subject-object delusion we have put ourselves into. That in reality, we are the subject, we are faced with an object which is a great problem that we have to take it, deal with it, and struggle with it for years, and then reach a point in the timeline where we will be freed of the problem. Whereas Bhagavan says, there is an underlying unity between the subject and the object, which is available for you on inquiry by asking, for whom is this object? And the answer will come, it is for me. In that self-attention, one gets a feel of what is the final realization that is present as Kantabharanam within each one of us. Bhava Shunya Sadbhava Sustitihi Bhavana Bala Bhakti Ruttama. That make that toughest problem in front of you as Bhava Shunya by asking, for whom is this problem? Who am I? This problem is for me. Who am I? That self-attention is Sadbhavana. Sadbhavana is the nature of the Supreme Self. The Supreme Self doesn't have any other bhavana other than I am. So, with Bhavabala, be as in the nature as the Supreme Self and free yourself of the nature of subject and the object. There, you get a glimpse of what is the realization the Acharya is talking of. Really, the self is unattached, actionless, characterless, immutable, formless, being consciousness, bliss, and the inner witness of itself. The self is all this, but then it has no sort of relationship with anything. The Purna Satta does not have any kind of relationship with anything. It is the transcendental self. Bhagavan says in verse 21 of Ulladhanarpadu, he says that Tannaitan Kanal Talaivan Tanai Kanal Yennu Pannulunmai Ennai Enin Tannaitan Kanalavan Tanundral Kanavanande Talaivan Kanalavan Poonadal Kan. The simple thing is the Supreme Self is present within each one of us, within the Vijnanamaya Kosha, in the waking state. It is present as told by the Acharya. The Supreme Self is present within each one of us as the I, as the self-luminous self. Now, those verses 8 to 22, they deal with what is to have darshan of God. We have tried to have darshan of God in various modes, but Bhagavan says the real darshan of God is when given the nameless and formless truth of the Supreme Being, in that to seek one's own truth and find that one's own truth is identical with the truth of the Supreme Being is to have darshan of Supreme Being. What exactly happens when a thought arises? Bhagavan says, when you let go of that thought, you are offering that thought as food for God. Unadal Khan. To the I, you are saying, you have given me this thought as gift. I am giving it back as Naivedya. Then alone, you will be able to offer your I thought as Naivedya. If you are holding on to the thought, you will not be able to offer your I thought as Naivedya. So when you ask for whom is this thought, that thought is offered. Then when you ask who am I, your I thought or the ego, false ego, is offered as Naivedya to the ever-present Supreme Self. And as this offering of oneself continues, when all the vasanas have been completely offered, then we realize the I, because it would have consumed us. And whatever consumes, the consumed will be of the nature of the consumed, the one who consumes. So once you have eaten your breakfast, that breakfast has become you, isn't it? Similarly, when your thought and when your ego, you offer to the Supreme Self within, you identify that your nature is really that Supreme Self, which is characterless, immutable, which is formless, which is being consciousness bliss, which is the inner self. It does not have any relationship with anything. It is transcending, because you see what happens when we do self-enquiry. For whom is this thought? It is for me. Who am I? The I thought is paying attention to I. When that is effortlessly there, then Tannayandri Anniyam Ondru Mariyan. There is nothing other than the self. That is the transcendental nature of Supreme Being. That is the transcendental nature of God. We have held the self as the immanent support without which anything cannot exist. You take a sensory experience, you ask for whom? Only based on self is there. You take a breath experience, ask for whom? When you take for whom is this time and place, there is the self. So holding the immanent self, we find that that immanent self itself is the transcendent self. Tannayandri Anniyam Ondru Nindru. That is where the self-luminous, the immutable, that Purnatva is directly experienced as our own nature. To think that it has any kind of relationship with the ego is actually a delusion. To understand that there is no relationship between the ego and this, and the earlier relationship that the ego claimed, that I am the self, and I am this body, I am this so-and-so. When it claimed like that, it is totally delusory. There is no meaning, says the Acharya, in such a claiming. That is why Bhagavan calls that ego as the Poliuir or Mapillai Thodan or Uruvatrape. The moment you set up an enquiry, that Uruvatrape will run away, will vanish. Therefore, now it is claiming it is the Mapillai Thodan, that it is the self here. But in reality, there is no such relationship, says the Acharya, that the ego really is not connected either with the bridegroom party or with the bride party. The moment you set up an enquiry, it will vanish. The false attitude of the ego, claiming itself to be the self, is due to the relationship with the beginningless false vehicle of ignorance. But even this sense of relationship is a delusion. Although the attitude of the ego to the self is without a beginning, that does not make that relationship real, that it can never become the real self. Just as water becomes clean as soon as dirt is removed, so it is with the self, that when the effects of the ego and its adjuncts are dropped, the self becomes pure and self-luminous. That is, when on enquiry, the nature of the ego is completely laid bare, and nanudiyad ulla nilai, namaduvai ulla nilai is realized. In that one sentence, Kanakamal says, Bhagavan has captured the whole of Vedanta. That the nanudiyad ulla nilai, see, the subject-object, the relative subject, when it subsides into the self, then it realizes that there is no object to experience. Then it starts understanding that what it was considering as subject separate from object is actually that object is also the self only. I. When somebody who is completely egoless is listening to you, there are no two people there. There is only one person speaking. When suppose you are listening to me, completely attending to your ego and keeping it at the source, then this voice is yours. There are no two there. This activity is taking place within you. And to understand whatever is said experientially itself, that nanudiyad ulla nilai, whatever is said is also subsumed into the self. When you are listening so attentively to who you are, what is being said is not non-self. It is also experienced as the I. In Guruvachakkovai, we were reading earlier this evening that when the self-realized one experiences the body of the world, he is no more or she is no more, there is no he or she, experiencing it as the body or as the world, but they are experiencing it as the pure self, as the I. That both the Udal and the Ulagam are the unmanifest self. So though the body continues, Bhagavan says, though the body continues, there is no cage. There is no holding of that jiva in a trapped nature. The body may continue, but its jiva bhava of being trapped in the body and the world is no more there. There is no prarabdha, there is no sanchita, there is no agami. It is completely free. Though the body continues to be there for 55 years or so, there is no bondage. There is complete liberation of identification with the self. Discarding of the beginningless ignorance with its cause and effects, the bodies and states I had referred to earlier, isn't it? That what all will go, the identification with the koshas will go, with the three bodies will go, and the feeling of being trapped in the cycle of Jagrat Supna Sushupti, that will also go. It's like ending a beginningless non-existence or the ending of a dream when the waking state supervenes. How will this liberation be? It will be like the ending of a beginningless non-existence. There was a beginningless non-existence of ours that is completely ended, and there is only the Sat, there is only Purna Sat. That is why make that Bhava as Shunya and hold only Sadbhavana. Therefore, what will remain? What will remain is the pure Sat. That thought is illusory. It is beginningless illusion. So drop it, Bhagavan says, and hold the Sadbhavana. And when the vasanas are completely erased, the Sadbhavana alone will remain. Liberation from bondage of the false ego concept can never come about without the knowledge acquired by discrimination between the self and the not self. So the Vivekachoodamani, that you may discriminate between the good and the bad, the good and the evil. You may discriminate between even knowledge and ignorance. You see, there is another teacher whose teachings we were discussing. His teachings is entirely based on analyzing the difference between knowledge and ignorance. But even there, for whom is this remains? That is, beyond that duality, the root duality of self and non-self still remains to be addressed. There may be a one with pride who says that I am thought free. See, when the knowledge-ignorance duality is crossed also, there may be a blank or a chitta shuddhi that is there, that is experienced, but still the experiencer may still remain. And I'm not telling this out of theory. That was a state I had got into, where I used to claim that I am thought-free now. And that is when the self-enquiry had come, and the ending of this discrimination between self and non-self, that ends all the dualities. So the other dualities, you may still have a pride to claim that I am a witness. I am a witness of the Jagrata and Swapna. But then this remains, the pride may remain. And therefore, that is why the Acharya is saying, without working on this discrimination between the self and the non-self, one cannot really say that one has crossed the delusion or illusion. When the intellectual sheath, since it is subject to change, it is part of a whole. Since it's insentient, since it's an object of perception, it cannot be the Atman. That means when it is an object of perception, it denies its completely object-free nature of the Atman. When it is part of a whole, then the Atman being whole, it can never be that. And since its consciousness is lit up by something else, it cannot be the Atman. Therefore, the intellectual sheath has to be transcended. That is the last verse in this section of intellectual sheath. We go on to the sheath of bliss. In intellectual sheath, what did we understand? The difference between the Acharya's pointing and Bhagavan's teaching in one sense is that in Bhagavan's teaching, Ahandai Undaye Anekam Unda. In Acharya's presentation of Advaita, which actually feels that there is a need to explain the various types of liberations and bondages, there the Ajnana is beginningless, but it can be ended since it is illusory, like seeing the rope which was appearing to be the serpent. The moment you see the rope in it, the moment you see the wood in the sculpture, the dog or the elephant vanishes. So that small difference you can keep. In practice, what happens is Bhagavan takes us to the Ajata, that is the unborn, uncreated. That's why Bhagavan would always ask the question, whenever somebody will ask, how can I end this? When will I be able to end this bondage? Bhagavan will ask, see if you are bound now. See if you are born now. That will be his question. Now that is possible because for him, in his teachings, his experience, Agandai Undai Anaitum Undakum. Agandai Indre Indra Anaitum. And that though the delusion can be ended in Acharya's teaching, and the self can be experienced in the same way as the beginning, middle, and end, there is this small point to be taken note of, that in Bhagavan, the ego ending itself is the ending of all bondage. Whereas in the Acharya, we are going to have the bliss sheath. The coming now to the sheath of bliss, the Anandamaya Kosha. What is this? This is a modification of the Supreme Self on root ignorance. What is this ignorance? This ignorance is self-ignorance. See, this bliss, where we go to sleep, you can easily understand if you call it as self-ignorance. See, what is the waking state? The waking state is subject, object in gross form. The dream state is subject, object in subtle form. What is our deep sleep? Our deep sleep is the subject, object going into laya, into self-ignorance. You keep it as self-ignorance. And since that self-ignorance has not been removed, again we are pushed out of that temporary deep sleep. That deep sleep is present, or the Anandamaya Kosha is present in all the three states, is what the Acharya is going to say. That what he is referring to, the self-ignorance is present even in the waking, even in the dream, even in the deep sleep. That means the Anandamaya Kosha is the self-ignorance that is present right through. that self-ignorance is bliss, is experienced as bliss here. It reveals itself at will in the three states of waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, and yields different modes of bliss, appearing as though that object is giving us the happiness. It is from the Anandamaya Kosha that we experience the bliss. Bhagavan will call it as, it is from the Atma Swarupa that what we feel as, we eagerly go in search of that object which we are seeking, as though that object is giving us the happiness. Says that is the moment that is God and you enjoy it. The mind, having lost that seeking, it is reverse catapulted back into the Atma Swarupa. And it is the bliss of the Atma Swarupa that is falsely superimposed on the object. We say that the object is so enjoyable that our team winning a cricket match is so enjoyable. If that were to be really enjoyable, then those who are not interested in cricket also should enjoy the same happiness, isn't it? But you will find in the same home that cricket will be enjoyed by 2 people and it will leave 3 others untouched. Really, the happiness of that object in the waking state, which is experienced from the bliss kosha, the Anandamaya kosha, is not there in the object. But it is the Anandamaya kosha revealing itself at will, says the Acharya. Now, the Anandamaya kosha is experienced basically due to 2 things, he says. It is due to the previous punya, the previous punya karma that you have done, that allows you to experience Anandamaya kosha, and it is due to Prakriti's nature of self-ignorance, that Prakriti itself is the root cause for the Anandamaya kosha. But this kosha is also limited because it has a duration and it has attributes which can be imposed on, which can be superimposed on it, that it is limited, it has a duration, and it throws you out of that. Therefore, the Anandamaya kosha is also to be transcended in self-realization, in revealing one's own identity as the Atma Swarupa. The dropping of all the 5 koshas we will take up in the next satsang or next class, as you may call it. You may call this anything. You may call this as Atma Vichara session. You may call it as satsang, which is what we see in the analysis of the Vijnanamaya kosha. We call something as, I say, I know that is a mountain. But to a cosmologist, that is actually the whole process of the Big Bang bursting into atoms, and those atoms present in the mountain now. He will call it as a formation of atoms. An artist may call it as a wonderful scenery. So the knowledge, the moment something, the presence of an object asks me, who am I? I immediately say, this is a cupboard. Whereas that is the ignorance of the Vijnanamaya kosha. That I immediately say, so-and-so is my brother, so-and-so is my, that is only for Vyavaharika Satya that we have those labels. And Bhagavan says that these are the duality of knowledge and ignorance arises in the Vijnanamaya kosha, and we just play with that unenquiringly. We take it for granted that what we call something is exactly that only. And in the verse that follows in Ulladnarpadu, Bhagavan says that Arivurum Tannai Ariyadu, Ayale Arivadu, Ariyamai Andri Arivu. That whatever you have taken for granted as knowledge in this world, since they all arise only in the presence of the self-ignorance, how can you call them as knowledge? They are better called as ignorance, says Bhagavan. No, that is the fragility of the Vijnanamaya kosha, which we take for granted. We take for granted that I really know that. I really know what object I am dealing with. But Bhagavan and Acharya says, go a little bit slow. Start practicing Atma Vicharam. And your attachment to this knowledge area which is so fast because it is closest to the self, says the Acharya. The attachment to the Vijnanamaya Kosha and the Manomaya Kosha is very fast. Therefore, the practice of Atma Ucharan will free you from that identification and will bring us to the self-luminous self, which is ever present as the Adhara for our sadhana. So let us sit in Atma Ucharan till 8 o'clock when we can listen to Akka. So this was the coverage of Vijnanamaya Kosha and Anandamaya Kosha. Later on, we'll have to see the removal of the Pancha Koshas as the next thing. Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Ramanaya. Revatma, you can set the time for Atma Ucharan for us. Thank you. We have actually gone to the Anandamaya Kosha in Vicharam, and some of you would have felt the bliss rising in inquiry. We have to inquire that also out. For whom is this bliss? So that is where we cross the Anandamaya Kosha. The Vijnanamaya Kosha will be crossed by letting go of the thought, and holding on to the I will be self-ignorance, which is the Anandamaya will be approached. Then there may be rising of that Ananda. Or when you are having some emotional hurt and you sit for self-enquiry, you will see the hurt be healed by the Anandamaya Kosha. You can feel that real injury to the jiva is healed from the Anandamaya Kosha. Just holding on to the injury, you will feel the Anandamaya Kosha eating away the hurt. But one has to cross the Anandamaya Kosha and abide in the self. And in that verses, Acharya says that the sadhu or jnani experiences the Anandamaya Kosha effortlessly in the states and fully in the deep sleep. Whereas the one who is sadhaka will not be able to experience at will in waking and dream, but will be experiencing somewhat in the deep sleep state is what is said about Anandamaya Kosha. Namo Ramana. Sorry, some more time.
Oh, wonderful, sir. Namo Ramana. Prostrations to Ramana, shining as the self in all beings. By the immense grace of the self manifest as Ramana, we are meditating on Vivekachoodamani, the translation into Tamil prose by Bhagavan Ramana, and we have been going through the Viveka the discrimination of understanding or separating the self from the non-self through the Panchakosha Viveka. And then that is the Sthula, the body, then the Pranamaya, then the Manomaya. And now we were meditating with Nandakumarji on the Vijnanamaya Kosha and the Anandamaya Kosha. So some very beautiful gems are, of course, available to us, and they have been highlighted by Nandakumarji. And in this, actually the process, he said that the Viveka is going from the gross to the subtle to the causal. So the gross is the physical. Say when we even have a look at the example which was given, the mud pot, thinking that I am apart from the clay, or the heated iron ball, thinking that I have become the fire, or our thinking that the fire has taken the shape of the iron ball. But that is the gross part. But then from there we understand that actually the clay has never become the pot. The gold never becomes the ornament. Though we can say that the ornament is made of gold, the pot is made of clay, but the clay itself never becomes a pot. The clay remains as clay, whether it's in the pot, and the gold remains as gold, whether or not it's an ornament. So the fire remains as fire, whether it is heating an iron ball or not heating an iron ball. And of course, Bhagavan gives the example of the sun to say that activities also happen in the presence of the self, but they do not touch the self. That is the example which Bhagavan gives, as the sun does not touch. A sun is not touched by the activities, all the activities that are happening in the sunlight. So, Nandakumarji pointed out that in Bhagavan's way, we have this underlying unity between the subject and object. One is a way of discrimination, of saying that object is different, subject is different, then you keep on holding on to the subject. So the object is the body, the world to begin with, and then the body, no, it is what is witness to the body. We go subtler and subtler, then we will say the thought is witness to the body. So body is different, thought is different. Then I thought is witness to the other thoughts. But then Bhagavan says, Manomayam Tadbhuvanam. So everything is permeated by this I thought. When one comes to that point of the inquiry, then these demarcations, all these needs for the Viveka path, which takes us from, Nandakumarji said, good versus bad at the mental level. Then knowledge versus ignorance. And so when we cross these, when we transcend each of these koshas, we do not discriminate anymore between good and bad. We do not discriminate between knowledge and ignorance. And then finally, the witness, the sakshi, which is in a sense the ananda, the joy of just being a witness, and the witnessed. All these are transcended through the Viveka, he told us. So, in this, very beautifully, he brought us to the basic aspect of the intellect, which takes for granted that it knows. If there is no taking for granted that I know, if I do not assume that I know something, then the question of being attached to it cannot arise. Yes, I know this is the truth, is what the mind, the intellect tells us. I know this is how it is. And this actually, the point, very beautiful point which was made is that this identification of the intellect is very immediate and it is very subtle. It is very subtle. So we have to, every time the mind or the intellect tells us, I know this is right, I know this is what it is, then we have to take the help of self-inquiry to transcend it. Ultimately, it says, it begins by saying, I know I am Sharada. And it ends by, even if it says, oh, I know I am not Sharada, there also it has this realm of duality. And that is how we are taken further to the Anandamaya Kosha. And very beautifully, it is said that the Anandamaya Kosha is permeating. Nandakumarji said it is permeating. It is there in the waking, it is there in the dream, and it is there in the deep sleep, which is ignorance of the self. That is the underlying or the base, the causal, the cause for this illusion, if you can say, is the not knowing of the self, ignorance of the self. And the point was made about ignorance itself. Ignorance is said to be anadi. It is said to not have a beginning. Then how can it have an end? And however, in the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna says, if something has a beginning, it will have an end. Yes. But if it has an end, it will have one more beginning. Because if we posit a beginning for something, then we are giving it a reality. This world was created. This world came into existence so many years ago. That means it has come into existence. Whereas Nandakumarji took our attention back to the fact that Bhagavan says it is ajata. It has never been born. When it is not born, how can we say it has a beginning? And because it has no beginning, there is no need for it to have an end. If it had a beginning, it had to have an end. If it was real, then it would have a beginning and it would have an end. But it is ajata, it has no beginning because it is not real at all. It is an illusion, says Bhagavad Pada. It is an illusion, so it will end with knowledge. There, the emphasis is on knowledge. And Bhagavan brings us this knowledge factor, the ultimate knowledge, through inquiry. Because other knowledge is limited. Every other knowledge would be limited because it is in opposition with the ignorance. It is relative to ignorance. Some better knowledge is still relative to some other kind of ignorance, because knowledge and ignorance are opposites. That's why one has to transcend the Vijnanamaya Kosha, which is the firmament of knowledge, and one has to transcend bliss. And a very beautiful point which Nandakumarji added at the last, after the meditation, is the 2 points which we have to really remember, both the plus and the minus. He said that when there is any pain to the jiva, it can be assuaged through self-inquiry, through turning back to the Anandamaya Kosha. In fact, the very process of self-inquiry, the intensity in self-inquiry is in order to transcend the immense pain of being limited. The immense pain of being limited and therefore being bound or gripped from time to time by both desire and fear. One wants to escape from this grip, and therefore to be rid of this deep pain, one takes to the pursuit of self-enquiry, and that self-enquiry is bound to assuage the pain, he says. It may assuage small pain, physical pain also sometimes. If it is the experience of sadhakas that through self-enquiry, physical pain can also be assuaged and mental pain can also be assuaged. But then the bliss is experienced either as in response to a seeking of relief from pain, or by itself in the Atma Vichara, which is also ultimately a seeking of relief from pain, one may experience bliss. Actually, this time in his Jayanti talk, Ramanacentre Swami said that he was prompted by Bhagavan to dwell on the, I think the Mundaka Upanishad or Mandukya Upanishad, I am not very sure, but it is the explanation in that, the verse, which says the bliss experienced by the sadhaka should also be transcended. The bliss experienced in the sadhana, and he explained that there can be an attachment to that bliss also. He said, of course, why is it said that one must transcend that bliss as well? Because again, Nandakumar ji told us today with reference to Vivekachoodamani that if it is seen to be transient, if that experience is seen to be transient and bound by time, it has to be crossed. Because what happens is that though the experience of the bliss in itself, even in deep sleep, there is no individuality over there, so it is complete. But on coming out of that, one becomes bound by that. One makes that into a new identity. One decides that I have experienced that bliss and now I have come out of it. So there is a time-bound experience. It is converted into a time-bound experience. When it is converted into a time-bound experience, it becomes an identity. At the point of the experience, then it may not be the time-bound, but when comes out of it and makes it an identity, then only it can be called, then it becomes the Anandamaya Kosha, because it becomes my happiness. I was happy and now I am not in that happiness. So it has to get into the natural state. In Ramana Gita, Bhagavan says that it is bound to happen, the same Anubhava which comes at the end of the sadhana will happen at the beginning of the sadhana in self-enquiry. One will experience the same truth, but it will be intermittent. So when it is intermittent, the thought that it is intermittent or the thought that I have experienced it and come out of it becomes another identification, which also has to be transcended through the same power of self-enquiry, by the same grace of self-enquiry. Om Namo Bhagavate Shri Ramana.
More Ramana. Thank you so much.
More or less.